It's military truism that big events hinge on small things. Sometimes simple engagements of few soldiers end up determining the fates of entire armies. They can even determine the course of nations. Battle of Sedan, 1870, about 330,000 people involved. Now, 330,000 is a lot of people, but this battle captures Napoleon III, ends the Second French Empire. That's a nation of 38 million people. Sometimes, though, they can be even smaller engagements, just a handful of soldiers by military standards, and they end up turning an entire theater. Sometimes all it takes is an hour in Carolina. Commonly, the American Revolutionary War tends to focus on the northern campaign of the 13 colonies. Battle of Bunker Hill, crossing the Delaware, and the surprise attack at Trenton, the remarkable victory at Saratoga and the surrender at Yorktown, George Washington, Benedict Arnold. There's a lot of great things there, don't get me wrong. But there were other theaters of the Revolutionary War that aren't always studied by the average American grade school student. And in them, just like any other major theater of war, you have remarkable personalities and spectacular victories and defeats. Some of them do get discussed, but there are plenty of overlooked moments that are every bit as amazing and compelling as the Northern Campaign. One of these battles will be looked on as the American Caney, a small engagement, but a fascinating one. This would be a battle that showcased how a general can make or break a battle. This is the Battle of Cowpens. The Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War was integral to the British war plan. After their defeat at Saratoga in 1777, the British Army had decided that their strategy would be to subjugate the southern colonies. Not long after they made this decision, they conquered the key port town of Savannah, Georgia, just before New Year's Day, 1779. In 1780, the British made their greatest gain, capturing Charleston, the South's largest city and a key seaport, forcing the Patriots to withdraw back to North Carolina. The British took 5,000 prisoners and received a huge boost to morale and supplies. As victory, Sir Henry Clinton sailed north to fight in the Northern Theater, and the Southern campaign was turned over to Lord Cornwallis, Clinton's deputy. Cornwallis was a decorated hero from the 7 Years' War and had a checkered history during the American Revolution. He had successfully taken Long Island, but he had lost Princeton to the Americans. The Continental Army attempted to send General Horatio Gates with a new army to salvage the South, but this new army was handily defeated at Camden in what is considered one of the worst American military defeats against a foreign army ever, even today. Gates's forces were largely composed of Green militia, and many of them broke and ran as soon as the British forces opened fire. Before the battle, Gates had positioned his untrained, untested militia against such excellent regulars like the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, while the corps trained troops faced off against a force of loyalist militia and regular troops. Now, to give General Gates credit, this was standard doctrine for the British Army, so let's not jump to the conclusion that he was just sending men into the meat grinder and staying back with the reserves. But even so, this battle was a disaster. Gates led about 3,700 men. About 1,000 of them would be captured, a little less than that killed or wounded. Gates was recalled and removed from command, and with the wounding of General Sumter at Blackstock's Farm, General George Washington needed a new commander for the Southern Theater. He sent his most capable subordinate, Nathaniel Greene. Greene assumed command on the 8th of December, 1780. Greene was still outnumbered and outgunned by Cornwallis's forces, but he was on the defensive, while Cornwallis was pushing through the Carolinas in order to bring the war to Virginia. Already, Cornwallis had run into problems. Patriot militia defeated a force of Loyalist militia at Kings Mountain, on the border of North and South Carolina, as well as other small-scale skirmishes in the backcountry of South Carolina that had arrested British forward progress. But the Southern Patriots weren't organized on a large scale. If Cornwallis could reorganize at Charleston and move north, the small militia companies wouldn't be able to respond in a way that could check their movement. Faced with his superior forces, Greene acted in a way that seems almost counterintuitive. He split his forces in two. Greene had hoped to threaten the large ring of British outposts that stretched to the Georgia border with his smaller, more mobile units. Either Cornwallis would try to attack one army with his large force and leave the outposts open to the other, or do nothing, and the Patriots could rebuild their armies so recently shattered at Camden. The man who took command of the other half of the army was named Daniel Morgan, an old, experienced soldier that his men had dubbed the Old Wagoner. He was actually a distant relative of the infamous Captain Henry Morgan. Morgan was a very physical man. Contemporary records all describe him as a muscular man from the Virginia frontier. He had been a rifleman at Saratoga, and he knew the rifle inside and out. And he was probably the best tactician that the Patriots had in the entire Continental Army. Greene gave orders to harass and delay the British, and this Morgan did, until Cornwallis recognized the scheme and divided his own army into three component groups. The left had the famous British Legion, a mixed cavalry and infantry unit skilled at pursuit to track the harassers down. At their head was an infamous commander, a young and ambitious adventurer. He's only about 25 at the time. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Now, the reason why Tarleton was so infamous was largely because of the Battle of Waxhaws, which is about 7 months before the story we're telling right now, on the 29th of May, 1780. Tarleton had attacked an American unit under the command of Abraham Buford and offered him a chance to surrender and said that he would only make the offer once. Buford refused, and Tarleton charged and then continued his advance during the parley, which was considered to be a violation of the contemporary standards of war. Buford tried to fight back, but after he had taken many casualties, he sent a messenger with a white flag. Now, the sequence of events here is important because it changes how you look at this whole sordid affair. What is known is that Tarleton's horse was shot out from under him, and it fell on top of him, and he was pinned. Now, the soldiers on the British side believed the Americans had raised a white flag and then tried to murder Tarleton. This is a horrible war crime called perfidy, and it's considered abhorrent conduct, even in the most ancient of times. Now, the soldiers on the American side believed that they had sent the white flag, and the British soldiers opened fire on the surrendering Patriots, with Tarleton's horse having been shot out from under him before the messenger was sent. Obviously, you have different accounts, and not all of them can be true. In an age without instant communication, it's possible that not everyone involved knew what was going on, especially in the heat of the moment, at the same time. Now, Tarleton himself was noted by sources on both sides of the conflict that as soon as he was able to get out from being pinned under the horse, he stopped the massacre immediately. Tarleton's legion, however, had been in trouble for discipline before. After the Battle of Monk's Corner, a few of his men attempted to force themselves on local women. Some British officers found out and put a stop to it and had the perpetrators flogged. Tarleton himself was reprimanded. So was it his men that lacked discipline? And if they did, how much of that falls on Tarleton as their commander? That's a question that many commanders have to struggle with even today, and they certainly had to do so back then. During the war, however, rightly or wrongly, Tarleton was blamed for the massacre at Waxhaws. Tarleton's quarters was recruitment propaganda for Patriots, and several British officers blanched at what happened at Waxhaws. Now, don't think that it was just the British who were guilty of this. After King's Mountain, Patriot militia executed many Loyalist militia after they had surrendered, shouting, "Give 'em Tarleton's quarters," and "Give 'em Buford's play." Whenever it comes to warfare, remember, no side ever has a monopoly on virtue or vice. When Morgan learned that Tarleton was the one pursuing them, he had moved to the Broad River, but it was flooded and turbulent, difficult to ford, and so Morgan elected to face Tarleton rather than be attacked in the rear while crossing the river. The place he elected to fight was a grazing area for cattle, hence why it was named Cowpens. Now, Cowpens is sort of an erroneous name. There are no actual pens for the cows. It was an open area where cattle were held before they were driven to market. The cows grazed on the grass and the brush, so it was a pretty clear open area near the Broad River, with just a few stands of oak and hickory trees to break it up. On one side is a steep ridge, and on the other there is a creek which makes the terrain rather wet and soft, difficult to move through. That leaves one open direction for an attack, and that's where the peculiarities of Cowpens' terrain come into play. If you approach Cowpens from the way the British did, it looks like a flat plain with a low hill near the river. But it's not. The terrain actually gently rolls and has small crests and swales, so that even if it looks flat, a fully grown person can stand and you won't be able to see them if that crest blocks your view. Sources differ as to how many men Morgan had. Morgan himself said he had no more than 800, but commanders tended to round down the number of men that they had to make their victories seem overwhelming and more easily explain their defeats. The conventional wisdom is that the figures that Morgan was quoting were the regulars and state troops that he came with, but more Patriot militia would join his forces, day by day. Historians estimate that his forces actually ranged from about 1,000 at the low end to about 1,900 at the high end. But what isn't in dispute is the composition of his troops. Morgan had a few key battalions of Continental regulars, but most of his troops were militia from North and South Carolina. As we had seen before at Camden, militia weren't always the most reliable troops in an emergency. Many of these militia, though, weren't green and untested. Among these militia were veterans. These were troops who had faced the British before at King's Mountain. These were the over-mountain men, frontiersmen who lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, and these over-mountain men were tough. Life on the frontier was hard, and these were men used to eating acorns and shoots during lean times, firing rifles to scare off wolves, being tired and sore but having to work every day. These troops, along with Morgan's regulars, were experienced soldiers, much more used to the sound of volley fire and the shock of seeing a bayonet charge. The British troops, numbering about 1,150, that were fielded were some of the finest troops present in the Southern Theater. Tarleton had his own British Legion, but he also had Fraser's Scottish Highlanders, the 7th Royal Fusiliers, and 2 3-pounder Grasshopper cannons and crew from the Royal Artillery. Just for clarification, whenever a cannon is referred to as a 3-pound Grasshopper or a 12-pound Napoleon, that's not referring to the weight of the cannon, that's referring to the weight of the cannon ball. Cannons are actually quite heavy and they usually require horses to move. Anyway, he also had the 17th Dragoons. This is the same unit that would later earn immortality in the Crimean War, the famous Charge of the Light Brigade. Tarleton was aggressive in his pursuit of Morgan, believing victory to be close at hand. If he could capture or kill Morgan with his back to the flooded river, Tarleton would have Greene's forces, stop Morgan's Fabian tactics, and return strategic momentum back to the British. In the immediate sense, it would stop the Loyalist militia from refusing to sign on with the British ever since the defeat at King's Mountain. If Tarleton was lucky, if Tarleton could knock Morgan out and expose the entire Southern Theater, Cornwallis could hit Greene while he was still amassing his forces, winning the Southern strategy and providing a decisive strategic victory for the war for the British. Morgan had a different approach. As the militia kept pouring into his camp, he met and spoke with them as a man concerned for their welfare. The militia troops that he spoke to, he kept asking them just for a few volleys, and he spoke to them all throughout the night. One of the volunteers, Thomas Young, notes in his journal that Morgan was a charismatic man, joking with his troops that the old wagoner will whip Ben in the morning, sure as he lives. Morgan instructed his troops with a simple plan in his direct fashion. Just hold your heads, boys, 3 fires, and then you are free. And when you return to your homes, how the old folks will bless you, and the girls will kiss you for your gallant conduct. Afterward, the militia would break to the regular army's left, leaving the field of fire free for the Continental regulars. When he went to his regulars, he let them know, the militia are going to break to your left. This is what's supposed to happen. They are not defeated. It is a planned withdrawal. The regulars were to form up on the hill at Cowpens and engage the British when they came into firing range. The next group was the cavalry under William Washington, who was a second cousin to George Washington. His troops were held in reserve, hidden behind the hill to engage on the flank once battle was joined, and this was a standard tactic for cavalry in the late 18th century. The last group was the lead group, and these were skirmishers, hand-picked troops from North Carolina and Georgia. Before a battle, it was common for light-range troops to harass the enemy, hoping to provoke a charge out of position or just to frustrate the enemy and lower their morale. This had been done since antiquity with slings and javelins. When firearms were invented, they were quickly incorporated into skirmishing doctrine. These sharpshooters had one of the finest skirmishing weapons available for the time period, the rifle. It's important to talk about the difference between rifles and muskets, like the Brown Bess musket that was used by the British Army. Most of the Americans also had muskets too, either Brown Besses or the Spanish M1752 or the French Charlesville. There's a few subtle differences between each frame, but overall the design is very similar. The musket has a smooth bore, which means that the interior of the barrel of the weapon was smooth. When a musket was fired, the bullet would ricochet off the sides of the barrel, pinballing down the length of the weapon, which meant that when it left the muzzle, it could be at a wide variety of angles. Also, the bullet would tumble in flight, making it even more inaccurate as it traveled. The Brown Bess was only accurate out to about 150 feet against a man-sized target. For that reason, the musket was a weapon to be fired from formation at an enemy formation. That would about double its effective range for combat. By contrast, these American sharpshooters were using a long rifle. Sometimes it's called the Pennsylvania rifle, sometimes it's called the Kentucky rifle. It's the same rifle. The bores on these weapons were rifled, which meant that they had corkscrewing grooves which impart a gyroscopic spin on the bullet, which solves the accuracy problem of a smooth-bore musket. However, these rifles are slow to load comparatively, because their larger bullet has to be forced down the barrel. Eventually, the rifling itself becomes so fouled with soot that they're little more than fancy clubs until you can give it a really thorough cleaning, which isn't always easy to do on the march and is very difficult to do in the middle of combat. They also didn't have a bayonet mount. You couldn't use the gun in close combat the way you could a musket. There were advantages, though, to a rifle. A novice equipped with one of these could hit a man-sized target at about 300 feet. A skilled shot could hit a target at 600 feet, or even further. Now, if you're an American, or if you've lived in America, or if you know some Americans, as a culture, they tend to be very enthusiastic about firearms. Many Americans, even today, learn how to shoot a firearm, and they certainly knew how to do so in the 1780s. Back then, America had a very frontier mentality, and sometimes that meant using your rifle. Sometimes for hunting, sometimes for home defense, sometimes just for fun. Morgan was one of these frontiersmen, and he had served and commanded a unit of riflemen in the past. That meant these sharpshooters that Morgan was employing were incredibly fine shots, and Morgan, who knew what a rifle was and how to use it on the battlefield, was about to show his tactical brilliance. Morgan's orders for these sharpshooters were to shoot for the epaulets, retreating and firing to cripple British field leadership. This is an era before modern communications equipment. Battle was very chaotic and confusing, and it still is today. But officers were brightly uniformed to make them visible on the field so that the enlisted men could see who was in charge and what the orders were. The sharpshooters would shoot, retreat back to the militia line, and reload as they did so. Morgan's plan was set. All he needed to do was wait for the British. When the British reached Morgan's troops, it was about 7 in the morning, and Tarleton had been pushing them since about 2. It was cold and it had been raining. It was just about sunrise. Anyone who's ever lived in South Carolina or has been there in the winter can tell you that despite the usual warm weather, it can get pretty cold in January, especially before dawn. This was the Piedmont region, which meant the soil was rich with red clay. When that clay gets wet, it can be very tiring and difficult to move through when carrying a full kit. So these British soldiers were cold, tired, and hungry, and Morgan's troops were warm, well-rested, and well-fed. That seems like a small thing to be warm instead of cold, but it's absolutely wonderful for the men's morale. Tarleton emerged from the woods, and he saw about 150 men standing in a loose formation, so he ordered his dragoons to attack them, and they charge. Tarleton is thinking that the cavalry charge can sweep through and smash a small, loose formation like this, but these were Morgan's sharpshooters. They take aim with their rifles and fire at officers as ordered. 15 men drop from the saddle, and this shocks the dragoons. Tarleton immediately orders a full infantry charge before he actually assesses the battlefield and moves to deploy his cannon. His infantry form up, and the larger mass starts pushing forward as the sharpshooters fire and retreat, just as they were told to do. The British infantry come over the small crest to see the militia waiting for them, now reinforced by the withdrawing sharpshooters. Just as ordered, the militia fire their volleys, and the sharpshooters support them, and they start to withdraw, breaking back behind the hill to the left, as ordered to do so by Morgan. Tarleton ordered his dragoons to pursue the fleeing militia, but William Washington sent out his own cavalry to intercept and push them back to the British line. At this point, the British troops are reeling. About 40% of the casualties they have had so far have been officers. But they've driven the Americans back twice now, so they engage in the pursuit. They were paying a high toll, certainly, but they were winning the field. They charge forward, and the line of Continental regulars is waiting, and they open fire as well. Now put yourself in the head of one of these British infantry. You're constantly pushing forward. You're tired. You're hungry. You're cold. And each time you think you've got it, there's another line of enemy troops, each one firing, each one resisting fiercer than the one before. They knew that they were at the final line of the American troops, since they were on the hill, and all that was left was the broad river. This was going to be an all-or-nothing move. On the British left, the American right, Tarleton sent the 71st Highlanders to push the edge of the American line so they can break it, flank the Americans, and roll up the line. The right side of the line was under the command of John Eager Howard, saw this, and he tried to refuse the flank. He was going to pivot his troops so they can fight the Highlanders head-on and protect that flank. In the chaos of the battle, the order was misinterpreted as calling for a withdrawal, so Howard's forces pull back after firing. This causes the Continental line to interpret this as a general retreat, so they start to withdraw by company. The British troops were emboldened, and they pursued Howard's apparently fleeing troops. But they were just withdrawing. Remember, this wasn't a full retreat, and you can reload a musket on the move. The retreating men have reloaded their weapons. Morgan notices this, finds a point where he wants the Americans to rally, and stands firm on his horse, shouting, "Face about, boys! Give 'em one good fire, and the victory is ours!" The line sees him, hears the order, they stop and they turn and they fire. From short range. A lethal range. The pursuing British almost ripple, and they fall apart. Their lines had been already loose because they were trying to pursue instead of march. And then they see the Continentals fixing bayonets and charging. Then Morgan unleashes his trap. On one side, William Washington's cavalry and the Virginia militia come storming in. On the other side, the militia who were behind the hill emerge on the right, and they close in on the British like a bear trap. The sharpshooters move forward and cut off the Highlander retreat, and the ambush is total. They were completely surrounded in a double envelopment. Many of the British soldiers put their muskets on the ground and laid down to surrender. Others scattered in an attempt to get away. Tarleton was left with about 50 of his British Legion and his 200-man cavalry reserve, which were held back in anticipation of launching the pursuit when the Americans broke. Those men refused Tarleton's order to charge and quit the field. It was even more dramatic at the end. William Washington and Banastre Tarleton would have a mounted showdown, with Washington swinging his sword and shouting, "Where now is the boasting Tarleton?" Tarleton would shoot Washington's horse out from under him and flee the field. While there was some talk about giving the surrendering prisoners Tarleton's quarters, Morgan found out about this and ordered that the prisoners would have terms. Overall, Morgan inflicted a casualty rate of 86% in this battle. A casualty is anyone who is dead, wounded, missing, or captured. That's an exceptionally high total for any battle. Morgan's own casualties were less than 200. Just as he had said to the militia the night before, the old wagoner certainly did quack his whip over Ban in the morning. Over half of Tarleton's army were now prisoners of the Continentals, and Morgan captured over 800 muskets and both grasshopper cannons. The battle lasted approximately 1 hour. What did that hour bring? The loyalist forces in the south were disheartened by the loss at Cowpens, Recruiting local militia and guides became even more difficult for Cornwallis. He had lost some of his finest fighting forces, like the 71st and much of the British Legion, and there were few troops that could match those two in combat. In the battles to come, there would be truly monumental casualty counts on both sides, but the British didn't have very many skilled troops to replace those that fell. For the Americans, it brought morale and fighting spirit because militia had been used successfully to rout some of the finest British forces in theater. It gave them the sense that the mind of their American generals could match British generals on the field. It gave them support for new recruits, for supplies, all critical fuel for any army in the field. It reversed the course of the Southern campaign and returned initiative to the Americans. All that from not even 2,000 American soldiers and an hour in Carolina. Thank you for listening.